From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you, and here's what's ahead. K-State's Ignacio Ciampitti talks about determining the dry down rate for corn as an indicator of when a given field is ready for harvest, and citing recent K-State research that measured the pace of that dry down. Also, highlights from another Cattle Chat podcast from the Beef Cattle Institute at K-State on two subjects: managing the cow herd to shorten the time it takes for cows to reach the economic break-even point, and things to consider when planting a cover crop for grazing forage this fall. Featured are K-State's Brad White, Bob Larson, Bob Weaber, and Dustin Pendell. And later, this week's horticulture segment, K-State's Ward Upham on planting spring flowering bulbs here in the fall. All that next on Agriculture Today.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State research and extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
Thanks for tuning in. You're listening to Agriculture Today. Well, the corn harvest is barely started in Kansas, the bulk of it still ahead over the next few weeks. You producers may be wondering about the rate of your crop's dry down as you contemplate that timing of the harvest, and we'll talk about that and some other corn matters here with Ignacio Ciampitti. Mike's side once more. Ignacio, as you know, is a crop production and cropping systems specialist, K-State Research and Extension. First, though, Ignacio, your observations at the moment about the state of our corn crop in Kansas as we're pushing toward that full harvest activity soon.
As always, Eric, thanks for the invitation. I think that so far conditions are quite good. We have some harvested. So most of these areas are southeast, northeast. I heard some reports yesterday, and 2 days ago of guys that are picking up some corn. Situations going from very good yields in many places. Also, but we are seeing a little bit of corn that is on the ground, conditions of bad planting, too wet, stocks that they are not really that strong, and then we are seeing some maybe potential fusarium in some places. So the lodging is becoming, in some farms, a big issue. So some guys are picking up corn very slowly.
Never the preference at all.
Exactly. But if you look at the yields, some places, yields are coming, the early entries are coming really good. But we still have corn, I have seen, still corn not really in black layer. So,
and that's been the worry, the late planted corn and whether it was going to make it to that finish line.
Yeah, it looks like, if you look at the weather conditions, temperatures are keeping up high, helping the corn to move fast, and move to I think in some cases to the finish line. But then the question that many farmers are asking is, okay, my corn is mature, so now what?
How fast is that dry down occurring?
Yeah.
Is there a typical rate of dry down that we go by?
Yeah, in fact, if you look at the article that we put together, in the past we always were using some kind of an average. So we were usually talking about sometimes between 0.5% to 2% grain moisture per day of drop. Black layer is what we basically mention. This is when the kernel is completely mature. And then black layer is when you take the kernels out of the ears. On the base of the kernels, you will see this kind of a black spot. That refers to a situation that the kernel is basically the connection with the plant, with the rest of the plant, was interrupted, which means that we are not changing on maximum weight, and there is not really any flow of water or nutrients from the plant to the kernels. And then that's what we call black layer. So for when farmers want to check for black layers and wants to go out and look at the ears, I will always recommend to make sure to look at different positions on the ear. Why we say that is because usually most likely the kernels that they are on the bottom part, or the middle kernels, are usually the ones that they get to black layer first. And then if you just look at those kernels, you might think, okay, the corn is done. Right. When you look at the top kernels, those kernels that they were pollinated later and they started the process late, so you start seeing that maybe they're not completely in black layer. And it might take maybe another extra week. And it could be a week or 10 days of difference sometimes between the bottom kernels and the kernels on the top part.
But you want to wait for those other kernels.
Of course,
at least for some period of time.
Yeah, because it doesn't make any sense to lose yield. If the kernel is not completely mature, it means that the kernel weight could change. Of course, we are not talking about big changes. We're talking about, in terms of yields, maybe 1 or 2%, very minimum at this point. But who likes to leave any yield on the table, more on these economic environments? I would say no one. So be careful about making sure that you check for black layer. And then the interesting point is the growing conditions during the late August, early September really impacted how well that kernel developed, and also how well that kernel was reaching black layer. One of the ways to identify black layer is by the moisture content. And we tend to say, trying to simplify things, that usually corn gets to black layer when the moisture content in the kernel is between 30 to 40%. Many times, in fact, we use 35, 36%. So why this number is important? Because you guys are usually like to harvest with 15% or 15.5%.
That's the ideal target range.
That's ideal target. Of course, we know that from there to ideal conditions, usually there is a big step. But most of the times, we know that we want to target that. So the question now that remains, after corn reached to the black layer, and then if we go to the case that we were reaching this point with 35% of water content, moisture in the kernel, how long does it take to go from 35 all the way to 15? And this is one of the main topics on this article on exploring the dry down of corn before harvest, is trying to understand and provide some guidelines of how many days are we talking. So if I have my corn is mature today, close to the third week of September, when I will be expecting that my corn will be ready to harvest? Research, in many situations, we didn't have enough data, so the last 2 or 3 years we accumulate a good amount of data looking at what happens on the dry down conditions. And then what we're starting to see is that based on the last 2 years is very, very consistent. We are losing around 1% of water moisture per day, which basically, if you're starting on 35, and if I want to finish to 15, based on our conditions that we have on 2017 and 18, we always took us between 18 to 20 days.
So there's a number you can more or less hang your hat on, or a range 18 to 21 days.
And that is based on, 1% per day. So the question that a farmer could ask to us is that always the dry down rate 1% per day? And the answer is not. What are the main factors affecting those rates? I would say temperature is a huge factor. So if you look at the temperature conditions that we have in the last 2 weeks, any corn that was mature by early September, it moved really fast.
Right, because of our heat.
And so if you look at the last 2 weeks, also because connected to the relative humidity. Low relative humidity, not many precipitations compared with what we have in August. Yeah. And then corn really moved fast. And probably our dry down rate in some places was even faster than that. In some places, maybe it dropped 1.5 points per day. Okay? And there is some sort of variability. So it's like everything in biology, everything in agronomy. It's like we always think, this is a 1% average, but we know that this can go from 0.5% to more or less 2 or 2.5%. My practical experience is telling me that most of the times goes from 0.5% to 2. And then let me give you an example. So we were checking some plots. I think that was last week in Garden City, and we were looking at dry down, and then we were looking at 5 days after we went from 22 to 18. Okay, so that kind of gives you some idea of that 1% rate. But then if you go back to some of the corn that will be entering into black layer this week or the following week, I will say we shouldn't be expecting that fast dry down.
Because that rate is going to shrink.
Exactly, and for a couple of conditions. One is the temperature. So what are you looking at the forecast the next coming days, and then you go from 90s to to start going on to 80s and maybe mid 70s. So usually with low temperatures, we'll have a lower dry down. Okay. So we are looking potentially next coming weeks, maybe relative humidity, cloudy days, and more rain, more wet conditions. The rate of dry down is affected. Why? Well, because the plant cannot desiccate as fast as possible, and in some situations, these kernels are, even when they might lose a point, maybe the following day they might maintain, or they might even regain, but very small, but they might maintain and not drop too much, I mean, based on the temperature conditions. The most important factor is to mention that based on our research, based on the experiences that we are seeing from the last years, most of the times you need to remember early planted, or I would say normal planting dates, 2017-18, 1% was a good dry down rate. I will say that in our case, we might need to be expecting that some of the corn entering into black layer in the next week or next 2 weeks, we need to look at maybe less, close to 0.5%.
But it gives you a reasonable idea.
Yeah, of course. I mean, so if a farmer is entering into black layer or checking the fields tomorrow, that farmer can have some good idea to say, okay, if I am in black layer, and usually black layer is with 35% grain moisture, so I should go back to these fields, I mean, at least maybe in 15, 20 days.
And you can prioritize the order in which you harvest your fields, which is very important from the efficiency standpoint. I
think that this is the most relevant point of this idea of this research, is also to make sure that we farmers start to think about more strategically, and then they can put priorities based on how the different fields are reaching to maturity. And based on that, they can just make a kind of a nice harvest plan. Which are the fields that they need to be harvested first?
Well, this article says a lot about this, and it's worth reading, producers. It's timely in that it was posted just this past Friday, September the 13th, in the Agronomy E-Update series, The Rate of Dry Down in Corn Before Harvest. Ignacio, appreciate the comments. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric.
He is Ignacio Ciampitti, crop production, cropping systems specialist with K-State Research and Extension. And we'll be back with more on this Agriculture Today. Legal and financial concerns surround the day-to-day management of the agricultural industry. Producers, ag creditors, and USDA agencies rely on Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. If you've received an adverse decision from the USDA or have an ag credit concern, call today, 800-321-3276, or visit us online, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services, exploring options, generating solutions. We're back on Agriculture Today. It's been a while since we drew from the weekly Cattle Chat podcast out of the Beef Cattle Institute here at K-State, but the BCI team recently sat down for their roundtable discussion, and they took up a couple of pertinent topics for this stage of the production season. Here are veterinarian Bob Larson, cow-calf specialist Bob Weaber, livestock economist Dustin Pendell, and your moderator, veterinarian Brad White.
We received a fair bit of feedback on our poll question. Our poll question last week, and we asked both on Twitter and Facebook, was how long does it take a cow to break even in your herd? And what we found was when we lumped those together and we looked at 5- and 6-year-olds versus 7- and 8-year-olds, 78% of people said it's 5 to 6 when their cow first breaks even. When you break that out a little further and we look at some of our numbers, there was about 45% of the people that said as a 4-year-old she breaks even, which flipped the other way. 55% of those people are saying our cows don't break even until they're 6, 7, or 8 years old. So it's a pretty important investment when we bring a heifer or a new animal into the herd, and to think that she doesn't break even or start making us money until she's 6, 7, 8. What can I do to influence that? What do you guys see as some of the options to try to help my cow break even?
Well, first of all, I think this is an important issue, and I've created kind of a little spreadsheet to look at this. Depending on what the actual situation is, it can vary a lot in that if my heifer replacement cost is relatively low and my colt cow cost is pretty high, you can get that break even down to 4 or 5 years of age. But if the situation is reversed, it can actually get quite high, and where in some of the scenarios I can run, she never breaks even. And so it's a very important number to kind of have a handle on, because that also drives then just how important reproductive efficiency is.
Yeah, keeping those young females productive in the herd, and so some focused efforts on sort of management of those young cows. Because you're exactly right. You go through and look at the age distribution. The profitable herds have a higher percentage of old cows, right? Because they're the ones that are making money.
Well, from a timeline standpoint, you start with heifer development. And now when I say heifer development and I want to keep the costs low, that doesn't necessarily mean just, restrict them on nutrition, because it's really the cost per pregnant heifer that enters the herd.
Yep.
So if my reproductive efficiency isn't as good with that group of heifers, and maybe the reason I don't have as good a reproductive efficiency is I didn't get the groceries into them to get a high percentage of them to reach puberty.
It's an optimization exercise,
It's an optimization
not a
exercise.
minimization exercise.
So
right.
I don't want to spend any more on feed than I have to, but I want to spend enough to get the number of heifers pregnant to reach puberty that I need.
But
So
it's about that average cost in the herd of what it takes to get them.
Yeah, you can't just count the cost of the heifers that made it into the herd. You have to look at the entire your heifer development cost and divide it by the number of pregnant heifers that you brought into the herd.
And I think that's a good way to think of it, because those heifers that stay in the herd, they essentially absorb additional costs from their sisters that didn't stay.
Exactly. But focusing on that, so doing a good job with heifer development, optimizing the cost is where you start, at least in the lifetime of the animal.
Yeah, I think one of the strategies too you can think about on those, feeding and developing heifers, the ones that don't breed, if you sort of manage that set of inputs relative to, can I capture the value as a backgrounder on those females and make that pay? That has a tendency to kind of help keep your investment in those heifers in check, right? So
a decent amount of return back on those heifers, even though they didn't meet your target as a pregnant replacement heifer.
You haven't spent $500 extra in feed costs. You've balanced that against an outcome that you may make the backgrounding part a break-even exercise.
A little bit tougher,
but it helps kind of keep your feeds and inputs in perspective.
Yeah, another one to think about is really, when I've done my little spreadsheet, the value of the colt cows matters a lot. So some of that is, cyclical that I can't control, such as, because of other market forces. But some of it I can control as far as the timing of when I actually market the colt cows and the weight that I market them in. Is there a chance to put some relatively cheap gain on a colt cow and hit a better market? So managing the colt cow value the best I can. Again, some of that's outside my hands, but some of it I can control.
Yeah, deferring marketing on those, particularly if you're a spring calver, past the first of the year into a February colt cow market, historically has been a pretty profitable exercise. And so figuring out
if it's cost efficient and you've got the
feed. You got the feed, but it doesn't take a lot of expensive groceries to put 100 or 200 pounds on an open cow over a 3-month period. That's pretty easy to do. So
absolutely, and you guys are really talking about managing depreciation, right? So how do you because you talked about
your initial
cost, your purchase price, or what it cost me to raise one, my sale cost, and then how do I keep her in the herd
as long as possible?
Reproduction, keep her in the herd as long as possible, which leads us right to our cattle chat checklist today, which is how to manage that cow break even. Number 7, I want to control my dollars that I use to heifer development.
Number 6, we want to think about both the weight and condition of our cull cows and the marketing window that we sell them, to sort of maybe if we defer our marketing a little bit to capture that gain and increase market price.
Number 5, I want to sell more bred cows than I do open cows, which may mean I leave the bull out a little bit longer and sell some that don't fit my calving window.
And number 4, we want to keep the tax implications in the back of the mind when we're thinking about replacing cows.
Number 3, think about the relative value comparison between the cull cow and the replacement female going in to kind of understand the potential capital loss there, and maybe think about alternate strategies to reduce cow replacement. So either buying replacement heifers or buying bred cows.
When thinking about replacing the cows, we want to keep in mind the current prices, but also the future prices, thinking about the cattle cycle.
All right, and number 1, reproductive efficiency. When we talk about cow depreciation costs, one of the main drivers is how long we can keep that cow in the herd. So if we focus on things like body condition going into the breeding season, making sure the bulls have been breeding soundness examined and ready to go into the breeding season so that we can have high reproductive efficiency to control our cow depreciation.
Absolutely. Cow break-even is a very important topic, and those were our top 7 things to control the break-even in your cows. Bob, you and I were talking before, and it is that time of year where we're thinking about, okay, the grass is going down. We may have some cool season grass come on, but as we're planning, and some people will be thinking about harvest, and then following harvest might follow up with some cover crops in those areas that we could use for livestock grazing. And you had found an article that talks some about what are my considerations.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right, Brad. This time of year, we've had a lot of moisture in sort of eastern and central Kansas. Even I flew back from Denver last week, and a lot of western Kansas and eastern Colorado is still green. So there's been some buzz about, well, we've got some opportunity with a soil profile that's favorable to planting some cover crops. What might we do? And there's certainly lots of options out there in terms of winter annual cereal grains, all kinds of stuff from the radish sort of variety of stuff, mixes of those. And so one of the things that sort of resonated in this article was, well, before you make a decision on what you're going to plant, doing the planning part really pays off, because there's a series of questions that you really should focus on. And the first one's, well, what's your goals, right? Are you doing this from a soil coverage, moisture retention, soil quality sort of strategy, or are you really seeking some opportunities to graze livestock on that ground over winter? So I don't know, you guys have been out a little bit. Have you seen anybody chatting about some of the new opportunities on cover crops and varieties, or what they're thinking about?
Absolutely. I think there's a lot of people that have considered it, and it came in kind of on the crop side, and now we're discovering that on the cattle side that can be mutually beneficial. So you get some cattle benefit out of it. And then we've seen some people too that have talked about just using cover crops primarily for the cattle, and then their crop is secondary. So I think that goes back to what are your goals and how do you want to make it work?
Yeah, I think there's some real opportunities, particularly in some of the areas where grazing opportunity on traditional pastures is limited or expensive to expand your footprint on the livestock side, just using
expand my
crop
herd
ground
numbers without buying more land.
Yep.
By using the crop acres for some of the grazing.
Well, and it can change too the timing of. So we're thinking about fall, but I've seen people as well planting maybe some oats or some rye at this time of year with the goal that I'm turned out on green stuff 4 to 6 weeks earlier than anybody, because I put that in and you had the opportunity to go.
One of the other things to think about is sort of some of the agronomic stuff. So, if you've got to use some kind of herbicide or pest control on the cover crop,
when you can get cattle back out on it.
Yeah, so cattle exposure, but then also, there's a lot of those products will have a pretty considerable residual, and so you don't want to disrupt germination and early plant performance on the crop that comes after the cover crop, and so making sure you talk with your agronomic specialist.
Absolutely, because you may want to terminate the cover crop before you plant the new crop. You may want to wait till after the new crop is in, because you still get some weed protection, but then terminate it relatively early. It depends a lot on what your cover crop is and your plan.
And controlling, I've heard some comments about people changed what their plan was for the crop after the cover crop, and they got in a bind because both either the cover crop had gone to seed and became the weed. Became the weed in the next crop, and they had some limitations on what herbicides they could use to control that. And so making sure you got a good plan and some contingencies maybe to that plan.
From the Beef Cattle Institute at K-State, Bob Weaber, Dustin Pendell, Brad White, and Bob Larson. The full podcast can be heard at beefcattleinstitute.org. This is Agriculture Today.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128 plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local Extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Agriculture Today continues now here on the K-State Radio Network, now in our 95th year of broadcast service to Kansas agriculture. Now for you today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. You crop producers should not expect any delays in USDA programs such as the trade aid payments coming from the Commodity Credit Corporation funds. That according to the chairman of the House Agriculture Committee in comments to DTN yesterday. Quoting Representative Colin Peterson of Minnesota, it's taken care of. A political dispute over funding the $30 billion CCC funds blew up last week after it was reported the House Appropriations Committee short-term funding bill for the government, which is a continuing resolution, would not include an extension of CCC funds, which the Trump administration has been using for $28 billion in market facilitation program payments over the past 2 years. The CCC fund risks becoming short of cash if Congress does not approve new fund availability before October the 1st. Now, the continuing resolution would waive the restrictions on the use of the fund until the USDA is fully funded under a full fiscal year appropriations bill. That money would still come, but likely be delayed. Peterson credited Representative Philemon Villa of Texas, the chairman of the Subcommittee on General Farm Commodities, for drafting a letter earlier this week that brought the issue to the attention of House leadership. Several other Democrats on the Agriculture Committee also issued news releases earlier this week calling on leadership to approve the CCC funding. A spokesperson for another Democrat on the House Agriculture Committee told DTN that House Speaker Nancy Pelosi had assured the congressman that the language renewing the CCC funds would be in the continuing resolution. U.S. and Chinese trade negotiations started again today in Washington, and USDA Secretary Sonny Perdue said yesterday that a successful trade deal still must go beyond buying U.S. farm products. Chinese officials last week stated that agricultural products such as soybeans and pork would not be subject to additional tariffs for now. The secretary stressed that trade talks with China must continue to focus on issues such as forced transfer of technology and intellectual property theft that sparked the president to start trade talks with China in 2017. Speaking to reporters yesterday, Perdue said the U.S. has given China import targets for major agricultural products such as beans and pork. Those remain under negotiations right now. The secretary said U.S. negotiators want China to exercise already established lower tariff rate quotas on commodities such as corn and wheat. The secretary cautioned, however, against being bought off, as he put it, by some purchase agreements in agriculture without the structural reforms that the Trump administration has advocated since the trade dispute began with China. Meantime, Secretary Perdue believes a new trade agreement between our nation and Japan will be signed soon by heads of state, based on recent announcements. More on that from the USDA's Rod Bain.
Agriculture Secretary Sonny Perdue, speaking before members of the fresh produce industry Wednesday, recalled his own reaction and the reaction of many in the ag sector when news broke last month from the Group of Seven Economic Summit in France.
We were happy on the announcement from Japan, where President Trump at the G7 announced a principal agreement.
A trade deal that would lower tariffs on U.S. ag exports entering into the Japanese marketplace. And earlier this week, President Trump informed Congress of his intent to sign the deal. Speculation remains on when the president and his Japanese counterpart would put their signatures to the agreement. Both sides previously mentioned next week's United Nations General Assembly meetings as a target signing date, a time frame Secretary Perdue is hopeful will occur.
The 23rd or 24th this month, we hope that agreement with Japan, a major customer, will be signed there in New York.
I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
And yesterday, South Korea confirmed a second case of African swine fever near its border with North Korea, raising concerns that the outbreak could spread and wreak havoc on that country's massive hog herds. Officials were planning to cull some 5,000 pigs raised at a farm in the town of Yonshen after the contagious disease was confirmed, according to a South Korean ministry official. There are about 6,300 hog farms in South Korea that raise more than 11 million pigs. Next up on Agriculture Today, this week's edition of the Kansas Soybean Update. Here's Greg Akagi.
Sherry Seifert is joining us. She is with the Kansas Soybean Commission. And Sherry, Kansas Soybean Commission, well involved in the Kansas State Fair, and that includes the Invent a Heart Healthy Food Soy Foods recipe judging as well.
We had some wonderful entries at the fair, and they're really making it hard for us to judge these. They're just coming up with some very clever, easy, and very nutritious items that they've made for us.
You had 3 different types of classes for dessert, a main dish or entree, and quick and easy snacks.
Yes. We started out with dessert. That's always top priority. There was a chocolate ice cream that was very simple to do. Just throw everything in a blender and then put it in a freezer. And then we had custard, and it was very good, and it was made with the soy. And we ended up choosing the ice cream because it was the easiest, and it not only extremely easy, but it was very delicious and had a good choice of soy foods. The winner for the desserts was Margaret Miller from Babcock. Then we had our main dish that we judged was next, and we had spaghetti, and they even make a spaghetti out of tofu, and a veggie protein Frito pie, and we had a breakfast taco. We ended up going with the breakfast taco. It required more ingredients, but it was more well-balanced with the soy foods, and that came from Ginger Lehman from Hutchison. Then our quick and easy snacks. There was a Frito cookie, and they used the soy butter to make that cookie. And then we had our soy butter snack bars, and we had a creamy edamame hummus dip, and then a chocolate roasted edamame delight, which was just melted chocolate with roasted edamame nuts in it. That was very simple and very delicious. So we ended up choosing the snack bars, and they was made by Nicole Conrad from Topeka. And Jancy Hall and I did demonstrations beforehand. We made a soy protein ball, and that recipe is in our soy food guide that just came out. And then a fruit smoothie, and then edamame salad. We used it as a dip, but it can be done as a salad. And it had dried cranberries in it. It was very simple and easy to put together. And this year was one of the best interaction from the audience that we've had. Lots of inquiries, where to get their stuff, and different things. But it was a great day.
You can also find a full list of the results at kansassoybeans.org/judging. That's on the Kansas Soybeans website. That is Sherry Seifert with the Kansas Soybean Commission, who joins us on the Kansas Soybean Update. It's brought to you by the Kansas Soybean Commission.
Greg Akagi there. Many thanks, Greg. Our weekly horticulture feature is next on Agriculture Today. For 25 years, K-State Research and Extension's Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services has been providing a no-cost, confidential place to call in and visit with an agricultural lawyer. Our experts are available to help you producers handle legal and financial issues. Explore your options and generate solutions. Call us at 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. We're back now on Agriculture Today. Coming your way next, this week's horticulture segment. Here's a topical matter for the season that you homeowners routinely employ as a way to spruce up your landscapes in advance, and that is planting spring flowering bulbs in the fall. With tips on accomplishing that now, horticulturist Ward Upham of K-State Research and Extension. And there is a process to this. We'll get into it, Ward, but the basic question, why plant these in the fall as opposed to the springtime, these bulbs?
These bulbs need a cool, moist period in which the roots have started to grow before they're going to flower in the spring. So if you wait until spring, often they will come up, but they will not flower. So we need that cool, moist period over the winter in order to trigger them to bloom the next spring.
So we're talking about getting these in the ground any time now, right?
That's right. Usually late September through the month of October is fine. You can't even go later, but that's the optimum time is late September through October.
All right, the recipe for succeeding here, and it starts with selecting a planting site that will support those bulbs.
That's right. You need to figure out how much area you need to cover in order to figure out how many bulbs you need. And so, therefore, figure out where you're going to put those bulbs. They like partial shade to full sun. Okay, so you don't usually want full shade just because it's going to make them more difficult to bloom over a period of years. They just don't have the light energy. So partial shade to full sun would be what you're looking for.
But the density of your planting, that'll determine in part the area you'll need?
That's right. And also what bulbs are going to go where. You know, if you're putting in more than one kind of bulb, they may not be spaced the same apart. And you also have to know how much of each type in order to figure out how many you're actually going to need.
And when you say type, you mean by size, large bulb, small bulb?
As far as total bulbs, yes, but also you have to know species in order to know what you're going to buy.
And so one can ask at their local nursery about the species traits, so they'll have an idea of that. But how many bulbs will be needed? That's the question you have to answer here.
Yeah, so the larger bulbs, usually you're going to put those about 6 inches apart. You're talking about things like tulips and daffodils, Dutch hyacinth, all those types of things. Figure about 6 inches apart. The smaller ones, like crocus, maybe 1 to 2 inches apart. And so they go much more denser in order to make a good display. And be sure you get enough that it does have an effect. Just put in a few bulbs, usually it doesn't help much.
And you want to be somewhat creative here, mix and match large and small bulbs for a more varied display?
Yes, and usually, of course, the smaller ones go in front. And you're also going to notice like crocus is going to bloom before tulip. Mm-hmm. And so keep that in mind as well.
Well, this is contingent upon purchasing good quality bulbs at the same time, you stress.
And that is correct. So what you want is the bigger bulb, the better. That tells you how much stored energy is in that bulb, and that will translate into how good a display it's going to be. So we suggest you get those bulbs as early as you can, just because you'll have a better selection. And you can choose those large, nice bulbs.
Don't wait for them to be picked over at your local garden and nursery center. Now, in regard to site preparation, what does one need to do, Ward?
So once you have that area chosen, then one of the things you probably should do is this year you may want to see if there's rain in the forecast before you are going to be able to till that soil. If it is, you may want to tarp it, because you want to make sure that soil is dry enough that you can work it. If it's so wet that it sticks to your digging implements, it's going to end up being clods. And so you may want to tarp it until you have a chance to till it. But what would be best, if you could, is actually work that soil to about a depth of 12 inches. Mm-hmm. Now, for a lot of people, that's just not practical. They can't do that. And therefore, there is another way that you can get a fairly good depth of soil, and that is till as deep as you can, come back and add about 3 inches of organic matter, such as peat moss, and till again. Now, before that second tilling, you're going to want to add some fertilizer, probably about 3 cups of an 11, 15, 11 per 100 square feet. That's 3 cups, 11, 15, 11 per 100 square feet. You can use any other fertilizer as long as that second number is larger than the other two, and just follow the directions on the bag on how much to use. But an 11, 15, 11 is very common.
So heavy on the phosphorus is what's happening.
Yes,
here.
You want to make sure that those roots get off to a good start.
And when you're going through that tilling process, do you want to till as finely as possible then?
You don't want to destroy the structure, so you don't want to end up so that looks like flour. You want it to have a little bit of a crumbly structure, and that also helps water to soak in more quickly. If you work it up like flour, it's going to be difficult to get that water to the depth you really need it.
All right. Well, planting itself, how deep to put those bulbs, the standard recommendations are?
So on the larger bulbs, you want to put them about 6 inches deep. The smaller bulbs, what you look at is the actual width of the bulb, and put it 2 to 3 times that width. So it goes 2 to 3 times the width. That's how deep it goes. And so that gives you an idea. So they go relatively deep for those larger bulbs. A lot of stuff we don't plant that deep. Water slowly, but get it down to that depth. And so you may want to use, a lot of people use a hose just set to go very, very slowly. Some people use a soaker hose. But make sure you don't add it so quickly that it just runs off.
And then afterward, any need whatsoever for a mulch to conserve that water in that bulb bed then?
You can use that. It's not going to hurt anything, but you don't have to as far as to protect the bulbs. They are deep enough that it's not going to hurt anything. Okay. Some people also have problems with squirrels. Right. And if you do, what you may want to do is put down some wire mesh and maybe cover that with a little bit of soil so people don't see it, but that'll keep the squirrels from digging it up. The other thing to keep in mind is during the winter, often these bulbs will come up early. They may come up in February. And people are concerned it's going to kill them. No, it won't. You may get a little bit of tip burn on those leaves, but they can take a lot of cold. And it's never going to get deep enough to take out the bulb itself. And so if they do come up early, don't worry about it. Those bulbs are going to be fine.
Very good. And lastly, reiterating, be creative with these plantings you stress, and even just at random, see what you come up with, if nothing else.
That's right. And individual bulbs, one of the things that people often do is just scatter them out. Do not put them in little rows. That just does not look natural. If you just scatter them out, it does look like a natural planting.
Now, once more, without delay, get out to your garden center as soon as you can and seek out those higher quality bulbs and plan on planting those here in the coming weeks as our transition from summer to fall continues. Ward, thanks for the tips right here.
You bet.
On planting spring flowering bulbs in the autumn, that's Ward Upham, horticulturist with K-State Research and Extension. And that is this week's horticulture segment. We appreciate you tuning in and hope you'll be right back here this same time tomorrow. Until then, Eric Atkinson here, bidding you a good day for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.